Hello, and today's lecture is going to be on the nervous system. There is an assignment due before the final. Please complete all exercises for Chapter 10 out of the Chapner's book. The nervous system. Our first term is nerve. Our root term is neuro. The basic functions of the nervous system is to interact with the environment, gather information, process the information, and respond to that information. 2 is to regulate autonomic activity. 3 is cognitive, judgment, and reasoning. The nervous system is divided into two divisions. First, the central nervous system, or CNS. This involves the brain, our root terms are encephalo and cerebro, and the spinal cord, the root term being myelo. The second division is the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. This involves the cranial nerves, or spinal nerves. We also see within the peripheral nervous system the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. This entails the sympathetic, or adrenergic, and parasympathetic, the cholinergic. The sympathetic has the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, and the parasympathetic has the acetylcholine. This diagram demonstrates very well how the nervous system is broken up. The central nervous system, again, contains the brain and spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system contains the cranial nerves, which are 12 pairs, the spinal nerves, which are 31 pairs, and the autonomic nerves, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves. Here we have the image of the neuron. Starting from the left, we have the dendrites, or the branching fibers. Next, we have the cell body, which is the larger circle, the cell nucleus, which is the colored in darker portion circle, the axon, and then the terminal twig. Within the terminal twig, you see the smaller circles within that particular image. Those are storage granules. The gap in between is the synapse, and at the end, we have the receptor target organ. Surrounding the axon, we also have the myelin sheath. The neurotransmitters that we will be discussing are acetylcholine, which is a parasympathetic neurotransmitter, and norepinephrine, a sympathetic neurotransmitter. We will also be discussing serotonin, dopamine, GABA, endorphins, and epinephrine, which is a neurohormone. Neurotransmitters are chemicals made by the neuron, stored in the granules, and released across the synapses to receptors to stimulate action. To turn off our neurotransmitter effect on the target organ, we have two forms of termination. First is the enzyme degradation. The enzymes that we will be talking about is cholinesterase, which degrades acetylcholine, MAO, which is monoamine oxidase, and COMT, which is catechol-methyltransferase, which degrades catecholamines. The second method of termination is reuptake, which recycles the neurotransmitter. We will be discussing many drugs within this particular lecture. The termination of neurotransmitters is a great target for many of our drugs, such as MAOIs, which are monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or reuptake inhibitors, which is an example of SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. This image shows the enzyme degradation and reuptake mechanisms that were discussed in the previous slide. If you look at the storage granule, releasing of the neurotransmitter into the synapse, you see that there are 1, the reuptake transporter, and 2, enzymes in the synapse that are actually degrading the neurotransmitter. This will terminate our signal. With this diagram, we will label each part of the neuron. Number 1 is the dendrites. Number 2 is the cell body. Number 3 is the cell nucleus. Number 4 is the axon. Number 5 is the myelin sheath. Number 6 is the terminal twig. And number 7 is the synapse. The first part of the CNS that we will be discussing is the brain. Here is a cross-section of the brain in the diagram at the top. The brain, root term encephalo, fills the skull or cranium, root term cranio, and the head or cephalo. The first section of the brain that we will be discussing is the brainstem. The brainstem is composed of the pons, which acts as the bridge between the cerebrum and cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata, which connects the spinal cord with the rest of the brain. Within the brainstem itself are vital centers. There are 5 vital centers that we will be discussing. Number 1 is the cardioregulatory, which controls the heart rate, the thermoregulatory, which controls the blood and body temperature, the respiratory, which controls breathing, the vasomotor, which controls the contraction of smooth muscle, which in turn controls blood pressure, and the reticular activating system, or RAS, which is located at the core of the brainstem, is the center of arousal and motivation in mammals. It also controls drowsiness and wakefulness. The next part of the brain is the cerebellum. The cerebellum controls the coordination of voluntary movements and balance. More specifically, balance, posture, and muscle tone. If we have dysfunction in this portion of the brain, we see ataxia, or the condition of no order or coordination, essentially like a drunk walk. Next is the diencephalon, or the middle of the head, aka the forebrain. This contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. The thalamus is the relay station for sensory impulses and pain. The hypothalamus controls body temperature, sleep, appetite, emotions, and control of the pituitary glands via releasing factors. And the pituitary gland is considered the master gland. It releases tropins. The limbic system includes the thalamus and hypothalamus. This controls emotional experience and behavior, as well as memory in the hippocampus. This acts as a memory indexer for short-term and long-term memory. Next is the ventricles. This is the spaces or canals in the middle of the cerebrum. The ventricles produce the CSF. The CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, nourishes and cushions the brain and spinal cord. CSF flows in the subarachnoid space. Next is the cerebrum. This contains the higher level of thinking and judgment and fine senses. The convolution cortex refers to the folds of the cerebrum. As you see here in the diagram, there is a left brain and a right brain. Right brain people are more creative and left-handed, whereas left brain people are more analytical and right-handed. The cerebrum is also further divided into 4 lobes. The lobes are named for the cranial or skull bones and control specific body functions. The frontal lobe controls thought processes, behavior, personality, and emotion. The parietal lobe controls body sensations, visual and spatial perceptions. The occipital lobe controls vision, and the temporal lobe controls hearing, understanding, speech, and language. Next is the spinal cord. The root term is myelo, located in the spinal cavity. The spinal cord is protected by vertebrae, or inside the spine, and covered by meninges. The function is to carry nerves to and from limbs and lower parts of the body and carry the impulses back to the brain. Here is a great cross-sectional image of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is broken up between afferent neurons and efferent neurons. Afferent neurons carry sensory information to the spinal cord, whereas afferent neurons carry impulses from the spinal cord to effector organs, such as skeletal muscle. The peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, involves the cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Here again we see the sensory or afferent neurons, which collect information from the environment and transmit it to the CNS, and the motor or efferent neurons, which carry the commands from the CNS to either skeletal muscle or smooth muscle. This diagram depicts the different portions of the brain that control each of the different nerves. Note, you do not need to know specifically where the nerves enter into the brain. We will now discuss the cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs. The first cranial nerve that we will be discussing is cranial nerve number 5, or the trigeminal nerve. This controls sensations from face and scalp, including eyes, blinking, and chewing. The disease that we can see with this cranial nerve is trigeminal neuralgia. The symptoms associated with trigeminal neuralgia is intense pain and facial tics. The next cranial nerve that we will be discussing is cranial nerve number 7, or the facial nerve. This controls the face and scalp movement and expressions and taste sensations. The disease that is associated with cranial nerve number 7 is Bell's palsy. Bell's palsy is a unilateral facial paralysis. We also see blepharoptosis, or eyelid drooping. This image is an example of Bell's palsy. In picture A, you notice that the gentleman can only show expression on the left side of the face. In picture B is the same gentleman after the Bell's palsy has resolved. Notice how his facial expression has returned to both sides of the face. The next cranial nerve is cranial number 8, or the vestibulocochlear nerve. As the name implies, vestibular portion controls balance and the equilibrium. Therefore, we will see diseases such as vertigo, and the cochlear portion refers to hearing. A condition that we will notice with the hearing portion is anosis, or no hearing. We also see the new term ototoxicity, which means poisonous to the ear, and can be caused by aminoglycosides and loop diuretics in the IV formulation. The next cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 10, or the vagus nerve. The root term here is vago. This controls the autonomic nerve, and it's also a parasympathetic nerve, hence the term cholinergic. It also has another name for it as the wandering nerve, because this is one of the nerves that starts from the brainstem and controls other portions other than the head and neck, such as the chest and abdomen. Here again is an image depicting all of the different facial and cranial nerves. In this image is the depiction of the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs. As you can see, each pair controls a different portion of the body. The spinal nerves carry messages between the spinal cord, chest, abdomen, and extremities. This image shows the reflex arc. The reflex arc is a protective mechanism. Message travels back from the spinal cord via the motor nerve to move body away from injury, at the same time as the afferent message continues to the brain for interpretation. Next, we will be talking about the meninges. The meninges is a connective tissue and is consistent of 3 layers that cover and protect the CNS, which are the brain and spinal cord. Number 1 is the dura mater, which is the outermost membrane. Below the dura mater, we consider this space the subdural space. Number 2 is the arachnoid, or middle portion. Below the arachnoid is the subarachnoid space, which contains the CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid. Number 3 is the pia mater, which is closest to the brain and spinal cord, and has a rich supply of blood vessels. We will now be discussing diseases and disorders among the nervous system. Number 1 is a hematoma. or a collection of blood. This is not a tumor of blood. A specific type of hematoma is a subdural hematoma, which is from blunt trauma, blows to the head in boxers, and falls in the elderly. A subdural hematoma results from tearing of veins between the dura and arachnoid membranes. Next is the meningocele, or when the meninges protrude from the spinal opening, such as a meningeal hernia, or a myelomeningocele or spina bifida, which is a neural tube defect seen in infants. To prevent spina bifida, folic acid during pregnancy is recommended. Here is an image of a subdural hematoma on the left, an epidural hematoma in the middle, and an intracerebral hematoma on the right. Notice the location of the hematoma or collection of blood. This image is an example of spina bifida or myelomeningocele. Notice the herniation in the back that is seen on this child. The next disorder that we see is hydrocephalus. Hydro, meaning water, and cephalus, meaning head, refers to water in the head. CSF effusion, which is the escape of fluid into a cavity, may be due to injury or inflammation. Lumbar puncture, or LP, aka spinal tap, is a procedure that is done where a needle is placed into the distal end of the spinal cord in the subarachnoid space to remove CSF. Other specialized injections include intrathecal, or IT, an injection into the spinal canal, or epidural, a catheter is placed into the epidural space to administer medications. In this diagram, the central nervous system continuum is displayed. In the middle, you will notice that it says awake and alert. As you go up the scale, you see that there's CNS stimulation, which could eventually lead to death. Things that we will see as we go down is CNS depression. The effects that are seen are on the autonomic nervous system, which include the heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, and BMR. With excessive CNS stimulation, we will see increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, which could lead to a stroke or heart attack. Or we could see an increase in BMR, which is the basal metabolic rate, which could lead to weight loss. With CNS depression, we can see decreased respiration and decrease in blood pressure, heart rate, and BMR, which could eventually lead to death. In this diagram, the continuum of the CNS depression is depicted. We go from awake and alert at the top, and as we go down the list, we see that it goes from calm to drowsy to sleep to coma to death. Subsequently, there are medications that work at each stage. To calm a patient, we would use a tranquilizer or anxiolytic. For drowsy, we would use a sedative. For sleep, we would use a hypnotic. And for coma, we would use general anesthetic, especially during surgery. All of the CNS depressant drugs are dose dependent, which means the more that is given, the more depression that we can see. So we can actually go from being calm to death if too much medication is given. On the other side of the continuum, we see CNS stimulation, where we can go from awake and alert to anxiety and agitation to insomnia and to death. And how we get to death is we see usually with CNS stimulation an increase in heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, muscle tone, and metabolism, which all could lead to convulsions. Other CNS diseases and disorders, such as spinal cord injury, can result in paralysis, the root term plegia, loss of muscle function, quadriplegia, which is paralysis of all four limbs, paraplegia, which is the impairment of the lower extremities, or we could see weakness, and the root term for that is paresis. Another disease that we can see is a cerebrovascular accident, or aka stroke. Causes for a stroke can be a thromboembolic, or clot, or hemorrhagic, or bleeding. Symptoms of a stroke include ataxia, or loss of coordination of muscles, vertigo, which is dizziness, syncope, or fainting, aphasia or dysphagia, no speech or difficulty with speech, agnosia, which is lack of comprehension, hemiplegia, which is half paralysis, or hemiparesis, which is half weakness of the body. We can also see a transient ischemic attack, or TIA, or aka a mini stroke. A TIA is slightly different from a CVA because a TIA can actually resolve on its own. It's better to treat early and not wait too long though. Doctors say a bystander can recognize a stroke by asking 3 simple questions, and we will actually go over those 3 questions in just a moment. The 3 questions that doctors say a bystander can use to recognize a stroke is ask the individual to smile, ask him or her to raise both arms, ask the person to coherently speak a simple sentence. If he or she has trouble with any of these tasks, call 911 immediately and describe the symptoms to the dispatcher. This is today's lecture. Thank you.